The rich guests ignored the waitress, until she sat at the piano and stole the night. The tray was heavy. It was always heavy, not just because of the glasses stacked on it, 4 of them filled to the brim with sparkling water that no one had asked for yet but would expect the moment they looked up. It was heavy because of what it meant, what carrying it said about who you were in a room like this. Mara Ellis had been carrying trays since she was 22. She was 27 now. 5 years of navigating between chairs pulled too far from tables, of dodging men who gestured with their hands without checking what was behind them, of learning which guests wanted eye contact and which ones wanted her to be furniture. Tonight was different. Tonight was supposed to be the biggest night of the year at the Hargrove Grand Hotel, and every single member of the staff had been reminded of that at least 3 times before 7 o'clock. The annual Whitmore Charity Gala, the kind of event where the word charity meant something different than it did in the rest of the world. Out there, charity meant giving something up. In here, it meant being seen giving something up, which was an entirely different thing. Mara had been assigned to the east wing of the ballroom, which covered 6 round tables, 1 service station, and a corner of the room near the tall windows that looked out onto the hotel garden. The garden was lit up tonight. Warm yellow lights had been strung through the hedges. From outside, looking in, the whole ballroom must have looked like something from a film. She knew this because she had seen it from outside once, 2 years ago, when she arrived for her shift through the service entrance and glanced back through the glass before the door closed. From the inside, it looked different. From the inside, you could see all the parts the camera would never show. The way the older gentleman at table 4 had already snapped his fingers in the direction of another waitress twice, even though his glass was still full. The way the woman in the silver dress at table 6 had looked Mara up and down when she first approached, not with cruelty exactly, but with the kind of casual dismissal that does not even realize it is being unkind. The way several guests moved through conversations without once looking at the people who served them, as if the staff were a hotel feature, like the chandeliers or the carpet pattern. Mara moved through it the way she always did. She kept her shoulders straight, her tray level, her expression neutral and pleasant in equal measure. She had learned this balance over years. Too warm and guests took liberties. Too cool and managers took notice. The ideal was something in between professional warmth, her training materials had called it. She had always found that phrase interesting, as if warmth could be a policy. The ballroom itself was extraordinary, and she was not immune to that, even after 3 years of working this particular event. The ceiling was painted ivory and gold, with a mural at its center that depicted some scene of classical figures she had never had time to properly study. The chandeliers were real crystal. She knew this because one of the older members of the kitchen staff, a man named Dennis who had worked at the hotel for 19 years and knew everything about the building, had told her once that replacing a single chandelier would cost more than the annual salary of every person who worked in the kitchen combined. She had laughed at the time. Dennis had not been laughing. The tables were dressed in white linen, each one set with more cutlery than most people used in a week, each piece polished to a shine that caught the light when guests moved. Centerpieces stood tall white flowers she did not know the name of, arranged so precisely that they looked almost artificial. There were name cards. There were menus printed on thick cream paper with a font she recognized as the kind that costs money to own. There was champagne at each setting, already poured, already waiting. And at the far end of the room, against the wall between 2 tall windows, there was the piano. It was a Steinway. She knew enough to know that much. A grand piano, black and polished until it reflected the room around it like dark water. A velvet rope on 2 short posts had been placed around it, not to block access exactly but to signal, this is not for touching. This is not for you. It was the most beautiful object in the room, and it sat in its corner like something that had been cordoned off from the world, available only to be looked at. She had noticed it the first year she worked this event. She had noticed it every year since. She always served the corner tables near it, which meant she walked past it more than anyone else in the room, and every time she did she felt something she had no practical use for and had learned to set aside. She set it aside again tonight. She picked up her tray from the service station and walked back out into the room. By 7:30, the event was in full swing. The guests had arrived, most of them in pairs or small groups, greeting each other with the particular enthusiasm of people who see one another at events like this several times a year, and have developed a social performance of closeness that bears little relation to actual affection. There were handshakes and air kisses and comments about how well someone looked, how good the room looked, how every year the hotel really did outdo itself. Mara moved through these conversations invisibly, collecting empty glasses, replacing them with full ones, offering small plates of appetizers from a tray she had to hold very steadily, because the items on it were arranged in a way that prioritized appearance over stability. At table 5, a man named Jeffrey, she knew this because she had heard his wife say his name 3 times in a tone that suggested she was managing him, was telling a story about a property deal that had gone in his favor. He spoke loudly and leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had never been asked to make himself smaller. The other guests at the table leaned in or made appreciative sounds at the right moments. No one looked up when Mara refilled the water glass nearest to Jeffrey's elbow. She had leaned in close enough to pour without disturbing his arm. He did not notice. She went back to the service station. She picked up a new tray. Across the room, near the entrance, she could see her manager, a man named Paul Ritter, stationed near the door with his arms folded and his eyes moving across the ballroom in slow sweeps. Paul was not a bad person. He was efficient and fair in the way that people are when fairness costs them nothing. He had given her good shifts when she needed them and docked her hours once when she had been 12 minutes late because her daughter's school had called and she had stopped to answer. He had not apologized for it. She had not expected him to. She carried the tray back out. At table 3, the woman in the silver dress, the one who had looked her over on arrival, was now telling a story of her own. The table was laughing. The woman was animated, confident, holding her champagne in a way that looked studied, and Mara stood beside her for 3 full seconds with a small plate of food before the woman acknowledged her with a slight turn of her wrist. Not a gesture directed at Mara exactly, but one that created just enough space on the table's edge for the plate to be set down. The conversation did not stop. No one said thank you. She went back. She picked up the next tray. This was the rhythm. This had always been the rhythm. And for 4 hours, it would remain the rhythm. And then the event would end, and she would collect her coat from the staff room, and she would drive home in the car that needed its left rear tire checked, and she would let herself into the apartment quietly so she did not wake her daughter, and she would eat whatever was left in the refrigerator standing over the counter without sitting down because she was too tired to sit down, and then she would set her alarm and sleep. That had been the plan. But plans made inside the Hargrove Grand Hotel on gala night had a way of colliding with things no one had arranged for. At 8:15, near the Steinway that stood quiet in its velvet rope, something small and unremarkable happened. Small things had a way of growing in rooms like this. A woman near the window, young, in a pale dress, leaned over to her companion and said something. Her companion glanced toward the piano and then toward the event coordinator, a tall woman named Frances who moved through the room with a clipboard and a practiced expression of calm authority. Mara was close enough to hear the next part. "I thought there was supposed to be someone playing tonight," the young woman said. Frances's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted just slightly. "We had an arrangement with a pianist. Unfortunately, there was a cancellation this afternoon. We're managing the evening without." The young woman nodded politely. Her companion made a sound of mild disappointment. Frances moved on, clipboard close to her chest. Mara stood at the edge of the service station with her tray in both hands. She had heard the whole thing. The room continued around her, voices, laughter, the soft clink of glasses, the quiet movement of other waitstaff navigating the tables. She looked at the piano. She looked away. She picked up her tray and went back out to the tables. But something had changed. Not in the room. In her. Something that she had been setting aside for 5 years, carefully, practically, the way you set aside anything that does not pay your bills or feed your child, had stopped cooperating. It sat in her chest and refused to be moved, and the more she carried trays and refilled glasses and went unnoticed, the more it pushed. She was still carrying the tray when she passed the piano for the 5th time that evening. She stopped. She stood there for a moment. The velvet rope was right in front of her. The Steinway was right there. And the room full of people who had never once looked at her, not really, not in the way that means you see a person and not a service, moved on around her like a river around a stone. She set the tray down on the service station beside her. And she stood very still, on the edge of the largest decision she had made in years, while the chandeliers threw their light across a room that did not yet know what was about to happen inside it. The Steinway stood in its corner the way expensive things stand when they are not being used, with a kind of quiet authority, as if the space around it belonged to it and not the other way around. The velvet rope had 2 small brass posts, and the rope itself was deep red, the color of theater curtains, the color of things meant to be looked at and not touched. Mara had walked past it so many times over the course of the evening that she had stopped counting. Each time, something in her chest pulled tight and then loosened as she kept walking. She kept walking because that was what you did. That was what 5 years of carrying trays had taught her. You keep walking. You keep your head level. You keep your expression at that careful midpoint between warm and professional, and you do not let any part of yourself reach toward things that the room has not invited you to reach for. The room makes things very clear about who it has invited. It makes it clear with the velvet ropes and the name cards and the quality of the shoes people are wearing, and the way certain guests look directly through you as if you have the same moral weight as a coat rack. You learn to read it. You learn to accept it. You keep walking. But she had stopped walking. She was standing at the edge of the service station, her hands loose at her sides, and she was looking at the piano, and the thing in her chest was not loosening tonight. Her name was Mara Ellis. She had grown up in a row house in a part of the city where row houses meant something practical and not charming, and her mother had worked 2 jobs, and her father had worked 1, and they had been careful people, deliberate with money in the way that people are when money is a limited resource and not an abstraction. They had saved for the piano lessons because her mother had heard her humming along to something on the radio when she was 5, not just humming in pitch, humming in time, hearing the structure of it, and her mother had said to her father quietly in the kitchen that the girl had something. The lessons had started when she was 6. Her teacher's name was Mrs. Abbott, an older woman with dry hands and very precise standards who told Mara in their 3rd lesson that she had natural facility, which was the most generous thing Mrs. Abbott said to anyone. Mara had not known what facility meant. She looked it up. She practiced harder. By 12, she was performing in regional competitions. By 15, she was winning them. By 17, she was being told, carefully, kindly, in the way adults tell teenagers things they think the teenager needs to hear before they make decisions, that she should consider applying to the conservatory, that her talent was not just a hobby, that with proper training, with the right teachers, she could be doing this in rooms where people paid to hear her. She had applied, she had been accepted, she had gone for 1 year. Then her mother had gotten sick. The word sick flattens things that are not flat. It takes something enormous and complicated and full of hospital corridors and insurance forms, and the particular exhaustion of watching someone you love move through pain, and it turns it into 1 syllable that tells you nothing. Her mother had been sick in a way that required Mara to come home. The conservatory had a policy about extended absences. The scholarship had conditions. She had left at the end of the first year meaning to go back, the way people always mean to go back to things. And then life had done what life does, which is to keep requiring things from you until the going back stops feeling possible and starts feeling like a story you tell yourself less and less often. She had worked, she had sent money home. She had met a man named Colin who was funny and warm and not as reliable as he believed himself to be, and they had had a daughter named Grace, who was 7 years old now and slept with a stuffed rabbit named Clover and could already read chapter books on her own, which Mara considered the most extraordinary thing she had ever had any hand in creating. Colin had not stayed, but he had not stayed gently and without drama, which she supposed was the best version of that kind of leaving. She had the apartment. She had Grace. She had 2 jobs, the hotel on nights and weekends, a clerical position at a dental office 3 days a week. She had not touched a piano in 2 years. Before that, it had been occasional, a keyboard she kept in the bedroom closet, used quietly after Grace was asleep, the volume turned down low enough that it was mostly about her hands remembering rather than about sound. Before that, it had been the piano at the community center, where she had volunteered to give beginner lessons on Saturday mornings, until the funding for the program was cut, and the community center closed that room. She knew Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor the way some people know prayers, not because she thought about it, but because it lived in her hands. She had learned it at 15. She had performed it at 17 for the conservatory audition, standing backstage beforehand with her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and she had walked out and played it, and the committee had been very still in the way that meant something. She had played it once a year since then, in whatever way was available to her, because some things you do not let yourself forget. You do not let yourself forget them even when forgetting would be easier, even when remembering costs something. The ballroom continued its evening around her. At table 7, Jeffrey was still talking. His volume had increased with the champagne in the way that certain men's volumes always increased, filling the room around him in widening circles. The woman at table 3 in the silver dress had turned her attention to a new arrival, a man with gray hair and the particular posture of someone who had been important for a very long time. Frances, the event coordinator, was moving between the tables near the entrance with her clipboard, managing something that had caused a small crease between her eyebrows. The string quartet in the far corner was playing something pastoral and forgettable, background music in the most literal sense, music whose purpose was to disappear. The Steinway was not being used. No one was using it. No one had been scheduled to use it as of 4 hours ago when the cancellation had happened. Frances had managed it. The evening was proceeding without it. The guests had not complained beyond one polite comment. The piano stood there in its velvet rope, the most expensive and the most silent thing in the room. Mara looked at it. She looked at Paul, her manager, who was stationed near the service entrance with his arms folded and his eyes doing their slow sweep. She looked at the tray she had set down. She thought about Grace sleeping at home with Clover under one arm. She thought about the dental office and the hotel schedule and the left rear tire that needed checking. She thought about Mrs. Abbott's dry hands and the word facility and the way the conservatory committee had gone still. She thought about her mother in a hospital bed telling her not to give things up for good, only for now, and the way now had stretched and stretched until she was standing in a ballroom at 27 carrying water glasses for people who had never once looked at her. She thought about all of it in the space of about 4 seconds. Then she walked to the piano. She unhooked the velvet rope from the nearest post. She did not do it carefully or slowly. She did not do it with any particular performance of confidence. She simply reached out and unhooked it, because it was a rope on a post and not a wall, because the only barrier it represented was the assumption that some people were on one side of it and others were on the other, and she had spent 5 years on the wrong side of assumptions. She sat down on the bench. A waitress named Laura, 3 years younger than Mara and 6 months into the job, was standing near the east wall and saw what was happening. She went still. Her face moved through several expressions: surprise, alarm, something close to admiration, and then settled on frozen, which was the only honest response to watching a coworker unhook the rope around the gala's showpiece piano and sit down at it in the middle of the event. Mara adjusted the bench, 2 inches back. She had always preferred slightly more distance from the keys than most players. Mrs. Abbott had told her once that her reach was long, that she had good hands for the instrument, and the bench position had become habit from that early instruction. She sat with her back straight and her feet finding the pedals, and for a moment she simply sat there with her hands in her lap. The ballroom was not quiet. It was full of conversation and the soft sounds of a room full of people, and the string quartet was still playing something in the far corner, and glasses were still clinking, and Jeffrey was still talking. No one had noticed yet, or if they had not processed it. It takes a moment for the brain to flag something it has decided is not supposed to be happening. She placed her hands on the keys. There is something that happens in the body when muscle memory reactivates after a long absence. It is not like remembering a fact. It is more physical than that, more immediate. The hands know before the mind confirms, and the knowing moves up the arms and into the chest and sits there, solid and warm and slightly painful in the way that things are when they have been missed. Her hands found the opening of the ballade without her having to tell them where to go. They simply knew. She began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor are quiet. They begin almost as a question, low, searching, something that builds from patience rather than announcing itself. The opening is not dramatic. It does not try to be. It lays itself out carefully, gathering weight with each measure, finding its footing before it begins to move. It is the kind of music that does not beg for attention. It assumes attention, which is a different thing entirely and ultimately more commanding. The string quartet heard it first, or rather the cellist heard it first, a young man named Owen who had played professionally for 6 years and knew immediately what he was listening to. His bow slowed. He looked toward the piano. The violinist beside him caught the look and turned. Within 4 bars the quartet had stopped playing, not dramatically, not all at once. They simply faded, one instrument at a time, until the only sound in that corner of the room was the Steinway. The sound moved through the room the way water moves, filling the lowest spaces first, then rising. It reached the nearest tables before the guests at those tables had consciously registered the change, working on them below the level of thought, quieting something in them that conversation had been keeping busy. A woman at table 2 stopped mid-sentence. Her companion waited for her to continue and then also turned toward the piano. Frances, moving near the entrance with her clipboard, stopped walking. She looked at the piano. She looked at the woman sitting at it. She processed what she was seeing. The clipboard lowered slightly in her hands. Jeffrey at table 5 was in the middle of a sentence. He finished it. He reached for his glass. He stopped. Because by now the ballade had moved into its first development, the melody opening up, the left hand building its rolling bass beneath it, the music finding the first edge of its emotional range. It was no longer a question. It was a voice. A specific, particular, unmistakable voice coming from someone who had learned this music not as an exercise but as something that belonged to them, something they had carried in their hands through years that had not been gentle. The room was not fully quiet. Not yet. Real life is not a film. People do not all go silent at the same moment simply because something beautiful has begun. Some guests continued talking. Someone near the back laughed at something, a sound that was immediately incongruous with what the piano was now doing to the air in the room. A kitchen door opened somewhere and closed again. The sounds of an evening continuing despite something extraordinary occurring inside it. but table by table, head by head, the conversations were stopping. Mara did not look up. She was not performing for the room. She was not watching them discover her. She was playing the ballade because it was the ballade and it deserved to be played completely, and the room was either going to understand that or it was not, and either way her hands were going to follow this music where it needed to go. She had always been this way about it. Mrs. Abbott had told her once, toward the end of their years together, that what separated a good technician from a true musician was not skill. Skill was necessary but not sufficient. What separated them was willingness, the willingness to let the music ask something of you, to let it cost something, to play it as though something real depended on the notes landing correctly. Most people, even talented ones, protected themselves from that cost. They played behind a layer of competence. Mara had never been able to do that. She had never been able to play from behind anything. It had made her performing career difficult in certain ways. She had cried once during a competition performance, not from nerves from the music, from something in the third movement that had gotten inside her ribs and refused to stay outside where it belonged. The judges had not known what to do with that. One of them had written in their notes that she was technically brilliant but emotionally unreliable, and she had read that note and kept it because she thought it was the most accidentally honest thing anyone had said about her in a professional context. She was not crying now, she was playing. The ballade moved through its middle passages, the melody deepening, the complexity building in the way that Chopin builds things, not by adding more but by revealing more of what was already there, like moving a light source closer to something in a dark room and watching new dimensions of it appear. The music was asking things of her hands that her hands had not been asked to do in 2 years, and they were answering, imperfectly at the edges but honestly throughout, and the honesty was what mattered. By the time she reached the third movement, the ballroom was quiet. Not politely quiet, not the quiet of a room waiting for something to be over. The quiet of a room that has stopped doing whatever it was doing because something has demanded its full attention, and the room has, without quite deciding to, given it. Geoffrey had put down his glass. The woman in silver had turned her chair. Frances was standing near the back wall with her clipboard against her chest, and her face doing something it did not often do in professional settings. Laura, the young waitress, had moved without realizing it to a position where she could see the piano better. Owen, the cellist from the string quartet, was watching with his bow resting in his lap, and his expression open in the way that musicians' expressions go when they are listening to something that is doing what music is supposed to do. And Mara played on, her back straight, her hands following what they knew, the bench 2 inches further from the keys than most people would have placed it, in a ballroom full of people who had spent the entire evening looking through her. They were not looking through her now. The final movement of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 does not arrive politely. It has been building toward something the entire piece, gathering weight and tension through the earlier passages, and when it finally arrives it is with the force of something that has been held back too long and can no longer be contained. Musicians call it the coda. Audiences call it the part where everything happens. What it actually is honesty. The piece finally saying what it has been circling around from the first note, saying it without restraint, without the careful navigation of social expectation, without any of the protective layers that people and performances in rooms like this one typically wear as a matter of course. Mara's hands moved into it. The ballroom had gone fully, completely quiet several minutes before this moment, but the quality of the quiet changed when the coda began. It deepened. It became the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses gently against the ears, that makes the sounds of breathing and the distant city audible again in a way they had not been under the noise of the evening. 143 people in formal attire, in a room that had been designed to show them at their best, sat without speaking and without moving, and gave their attention to a woman in a hotel uniform at a piano that had been sitting unused in the corner all night. The coda built. This is what it does. It builds with a kind of structural inevitability that Chopin understood better than almost anyone, not drama for its own sake, but drama as a natural consequence of everything that came before. The left hand drove beneath the right in powerful rolling chords. The melody climbed and then descended with controlled urgency, and Mara's back was straight and her jaw was set, and her hands were doing something that required everything she had, because this part of the music always required everything. Mrs. Abbott had told her the first time she attempted the coda at 15 that it had to feel inevitable, that the ending, however thunderous, however difficult, had to sound as though it could not have gone any other way, like the only conclusion the music was ever going to reach. She had been practicing that quality for 12 years. It was here tonight. The final chords landed, 3 of them, heavy, final, complete, and then silence. Real silence. The kind that only happens in a room after something extraordinary, when the air itself seems to need a moment before returning to normal use. It lasted 4 seconds. Mara counted them without meaning to, sitting with her hands still on the keys, her eyes down, her breath evening out after the exertion of the coda. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. It was Owen, the cellist, who started it. He was a professional. He knew immediately what he had just heard. He began clapping before the social permission to do so had fully formed, which was why his applause rang out alone for 1 beat, 2 beats, before the room joined him. And then the room joined him. It did not happen all at once. That is not how things happen outside of films. It moved in a wave, the tables closest to the piano first, then spreading outward, and within 15 seconds the sound of applause had filled the ballroom completely, and several people had risen to their feet, the standing beginning at the front and spreading toward the back in the natural way of rooms when they decide something is worth more than seated acknowledgement. Jeffrey, who had been speaking at full volume about property deals for most of the evening, stood up. His wife stood up beside him. The woman in the silver dress stood up, and she was not performing this time. Her face had something real in it, something that had gotten past the carefully managed surface of her evening and landed somewhere more honest. Frances, against the back wall, brought her clipboard down to her side and stood with the rest of them, which was not something she did in professional settings, ever, and she was aware of this and did it anyway. Mara sat at the piano. She did not immediately stand up or turn around. She sat for a moment with her hands resting on her knees and the sound of applause filling the room behind her. She was thinking about something very specific and very small. She was thinking about a Saturday morning at the community center several years ago, when a 7-year-old girl named Sophie, who had never touched a piano before, had played a single 2-finger melody correctly for the first time, and had turned around on the bench with enormous eyes and asked, "Is that what it is? Is that what it sounds like?" And Mara had said, "Yes, that is exactly what it sounds like." She did not know why she was thinking about Sophie in this moment. The mind does strange things inside extraordinary moments. She stood up. She turned around. The applause continued. She faced a room that was looking at her, fully, directly, completely, in a way that none of them had managed for the 4 hours she had spent moving through it with a tray. She did not cry. She did not smile widely. She stood with the piano bench behind her and her hands loose at her sides, and she accepted the attention of the room with the same quiet steadiness she had brought to the music. She smoothed the front of her uniform. She stepped back over the velvet rope. She was still a hotel employee at a charity gala. She was still on shift. The tray was still on the service station where she had left it. None of the physical facts of her evening had changed in the 7 minutes she had spent at the piano. She understood this clearly, and she walked back toward the service station because the practical world does not pause for extraordinary moments, and she had always lived in the practical world without much resentment about what it required of her. But the room did not return to normal immediately, the way rooms usually do. People were turning to each other. Not in the way they had been turning to each other all evening, the social performance of connection, but in the more basic and genuine way that people turn to one another when something has affected them, and they want to confirm that the person beside them also felt it. Did you see that? Did you hear that? Who is she? Frances was crossing the room with her clipboard now, walking with the measured pace of a professional who has just had something unexpected occur in her event and is now managing the aftermath. Her expression was neutral as it always was, but her eyes were doing something more complicated. Paul Ritter, Mara's manager, had appeared near the service entrance. He was standing very still, looking at Mara, and his expression was the face of a man attempting to reconcile two things at the same time: a procedural concern about the protocol of a waitstaff member using the event's feature instrument without authorization, and the plainly visible reality that the room was still buzzing with something real because of it. These two things were fighting inside him, and his face showed it clearly. Mara reached the service station. She picked up her tray. A man at the nearest table, mid-40s, the kind of face that spent a lot of time outdoors, half rose from his chair. "Excuse me," he said. His name was Henry Cole, and he said it in the slightly uncertain way of someone who is not sure if they are breaking a rule by speaking directly to a member of the waitstaff in this particular manner. Was that you?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. That was extraordinary. She held the tray with both hands. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady and professional and carried exactly as much warmth as was appropriate, and she was aware that she was still performing her job and that the evening still had 2 hours left in it and that her tray needed refilling. Have you?" He stopped himself. He was a businessman. He was accustomed to completing sentences. He could not seem to finish this one. "Did you train? Do you perform?" "I used to train," she said. He sat back slowly. He was still looking at her in the way that people look at things when they have been made to see something they were not prepared for and have not yet caught up to it. She turned from the table. She walked to the kitchen door. She pushed through it, and the sound of the ballroom was replaced by the sound of the kitchen, the clattering and the voices and the heat, and the smell of food being moved quickly, and she stood inside it for a moment with her tray in both hands and breathed. Dennis, the kitchen veteran who knew about the chandeliers, was carrying a rack of glasses near the sink. He looked at her. He had been told nothing about what had just happened in the ballroom. She could see from his face that he could read something in hers, though. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You sure?" She looked at him for a moment. Dennis had been here 19 years. He had carried trays through events like this hundreds of times. He knew every protocol, every expectation, every unspoken rule about who was supposed to be visible and who was not. "I played the piano," she said. He stared at her. "The piano in the corner," she said, "the one with the rope." Dennis set the rack of glasses down. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression moved through something, not surprise exactly, more like recognition, as if some part of him had always suspected the world was capable of moments like this and was simply waiting to hear about one. "How did it go?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about the 4 seconds of silence after the final chord. She thought about Owen's bow in his lap and Jeffrey on his feet, and the woman in silver with something real on her face. "It went well," she said. Dennis nodded slowly. He picked up his rack of glasses. "Good," he said, and he went back to work. She set her tray on the counter and began refilling it. Her hands were still slightly warm from the keys. She noticed this without commenting on it to anyone, this small private fact about the temperature of her own palms. She filled the glasses. She arranged them. She thought about Grace at home and Clover under one arm and the chapter book on the nightstand and the left rear tire that still needed checking. She picked up her tray. She pushed back through the kitchen door. The ballroom received her, and this time when she moved through it carrying water to tables that needed refilling, The quality of being unseen had changed in some way she could not precisely name. It was not that everyone was watching her. Most of them were not. The event had resumed around her, conversation returning, laughter returning, the careful social architecture of the evening rebuilding itself as social architectures always do after interruptions. But she had been heard. Not all interruptions change things permanently. Not all extraordinary moments rearrange the world, but all of them leave something behind, even if only inside the person who made them. A small, private, unassailable knowledge. A thing that no one can unhear. The room had listened, and it had not been able to stop itself, and she had played every note exactly as it was meant to be played, and that had happened and could not now unhappen regardless of what came next. She refilled the glass at table 4. She moved to table 5. She worked. The evening had changed its quality in the way that evenings sometimes do after something happens inside them that was not on the program. It was still the Whitmore Charity Gala. The same chandeliers, the same linen, the same people at the same tables with the same champagne. But something had shifted underneath the surface of it, the way the atmosphere changes before weather comes, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that the body registers before the mind has found the vocabulary for it. Frances moved through the room with her clipboard doing what she always did, which was manage things so that nothing appeared to need managing. She was good at this. She had spent 12 years cultivating this particular skill, but her eyes kept returning to Mara, who was working the East Wing tables with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed all evening, and there was something in Frances's expression that had not been there before 9 o'clock. Something that was looking at a situation and deciding, very carefully, what to do with it. Paul Ritter was also thinking. Mara could tell when she passed near him because he had the face of a man in the middle of a calculation rather than a thought, and the calculation involved variables that were not his usual ones. He had protocol on one side of the ledger. He had a room full of important guests who were still murmuring about what they had heard on the other. Paul was a practical man. He understood how to weigh things. The guests themselves were behaving differently. Not all of them, and not dramatically, but in the specific and observable way that a room behaves when it has been reminded that the world sometimes contains more than it has chosen to look at. Table 2, where a woman named Carol had stopped mid-sentence when the music began, made eye contact with Mara when she came to clear the appetizer plates. Real eye contact, the kind that acknowledges another person as a person. She said thank you clearly and without looking away. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. At table 6, the man with gray hair who had arrived late and carried himself like someone important had apparently heard what happened from the woman in silver who was seated beside him. He was looking toward the piano when Mara passed. He turned to her. His name was Arthur Lynn, and he had been attending this gala for 11 consecutive years, and had funded it for 3 of those years personally, which made him one of the most significant people in the room by the measures the room used to determine significance. He was a man who had spent 4 decades in a world where everything was performance, and had developed over those decades a reliable ability to distinguish real things from performed ones. "Was that you this evening?" he said. "Yes," Mara said. She was holding a tray. She held it with both hands and stood with the professional patience that the situation required. He studied her in the way of someone who is measuring something. "Where did you study?" "I attended the Callaway Conservatory for 1 year," she said. "After that I studied privately." He was quiet for a moment. "Why only 1 year?" She looked at him with an expression that answered the question without using words, the kind of answer that contains its own completeness and does not require elaboration. He read it correctly. "I see," he said. He looked down at his plate for a moment and then back up at her. "What you played tonight was not the work of someone who stopped. That was not the playing of someone who walked away from it." "I didn't walk away from it," she said. "I just stopped having access to it." He was quiet again. He had the quality of a man who took his time with things that deserved time. "Do you have a card?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "I don't," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced one. It was a simple card, white, with a name and a number. He held it out to her and she took it, and she placed it in the small pocket at the front of her uniform, and she thanked him and moved on to the next table because she was still on shift, and the evening still had 90 minutes in it, and the practical world continued to require things of her regardless of what conversations occurred inside it. The last hour of the gala had a different sound to it than the first 3 hours had. Not louder or quieter, but different in texture. The conversations at the tables she served moved in the directions they always moved: business, social connections, the particular subjects that come naturally to people in a room of this kind. But when she arrived at a table to refill a glass or clear a plate, something in the room's behavior shifted. People made space. They acknowledged her. A woman named Helen at table 1, who had not spoken directly to Mara or any of the other waitstaff all evening, held up a hand when she approached and said, "Could I ask you something?" And she asked it genuinely, with interest, about how long it had taken to learn the piece she had played, about whether she had always played classical music, about where she had grown up. It was a brief conversation. Mara answered honestly and clearly, and did not perform either modesty or pride. She answered the way she answered things that were simply true. Laura came to her near the service station, with an expression that had shed all of its professional neutrality. "I cannot believe you did that," Laura said. "It needed to be done," Mara said. "It didn't actually need to be done," Laura said. "Nothing required it. The event was proceeding fine." Mara looked at her. "The piano needed to be played," she said. Laura was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed a real laugh, short and surprised. "You're going to get in trouble," Laura said. "Maybe," Mara said. "Was it worth it?" Mara thought about the 4 seconds of silence. She thought about Owen's bow. She thought about the way the room had gone quiet without deciding to, pulled there by something that didn't negotiate about attention, but simply commanded it. "Yes," she said. Laura looked at her for another moment, and there was something in her face that was not admiration exactly, but was adjacent to it, something that recognized in another person a quality it would like to have more access to in itself. The event wound down the way these events always did, slowly, with conversations that extended past the official end time, because wealthy people in good rooms do not feel bound by schedules. The catering staff began the quiet work of clearing, moving carefully around guests who were still seated and talking, collecting the architectural remains of the evening in a way designed to be invisible. Mara worked with the others, efficient and steady, her tray moving in its practiced rhythm. At 10:45, Paul Ritter asked her to come to the side corridor near the service entrance when she had a moment. She went. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, a posture that in Paul meant he was being careful with something. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You know that was outside procedure," he said. "Yes," she said. "The piano is part of the event setup. It's not something staff use." "I know," she said. He looked at her. His face was doing the calculation again. "Frances asked me who authorized it," he said. "I told her there was an emergency arrangement when the pianist canceled. I told her the hotel had made a last-minute adjustment." Mara looked at him carefully. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he said, "I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "The event coordinator from the Whitmore Foundation called Frances. They want to know if the hotel has a staff pianist available for next year's event." He paused. "That's not a thing we have. We'd have to create the arrangement." She said nothing. "I'm not saying anything tonight," Paul said. "Tonight we need to finish the breakdown and I need the east wing cleared by midnight. But," he stopped. "But," He left the word there and walked back toward the main ballroom without finishing the sentence, which was the most she had ever heard Paul Ritter say without completing a point, and she understood that the incomplete sentence was itself the point. She went back to work. At 11:50, she collected her coat from the staff room. Dennis was sitting in the break area with a cup of tea and his coat already on, waiting for the last 10 minutes of his shift to pass. He looked at her when she came in. "People are still talking about it," he said. "I know," she said. "Henry Cole asked Francis for your name," Dennis said. "He's on the hotel's board of trustees, apparently." She buttoned her coat. "Arthur Lynn spoke to Paul before he left," Dennis added. "I don't know what he said." Paul's face was interesting after. She put her hand in the small front pocket of her uniform and felt the edge of the card Arthur Lynn had given her. It was still there, small and stiff and real. She said good night to Dennis. She walked out through the service entrance, into the cool air behind the hotel, and the sounds of the ballroom fell away behind the closing door. The garden lights were still on, the warm yellow strings through the hedges still burning in the dark. She stood in the service parking area and felt the cold on her face and breathed out slowly. The card was in her pocket. She had not looked at it yet. She had felt its edge 6 times over the course of the evening without pulling it out. The way you keep checking that something is still there without looking directly at it, because looking at it directly makes it real and real things can disappoint you. And right now in the parking lot at 11:50 with the garden lights still burning and the sound of the city in every direction, she wanted to hold the possibility a little longer before she asked it to become a fact. She got into her car. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, not on the wheel yet, just sitting. The dashboard was dark. The parking lot was quiet. Somewhere beyond the hedge, she could hear the faint sound of the last guests leaving through the main entrance, voices and the sound of car doors, the gradual draining of the evening. She thought about her daughter asleep in the apartment. She thought about the chapter book on the nightstand and Clover under one arm and the way Grace, at 7, could already read things that moved her, already paused over sentences that were particularly good and looked up and asked, "Why does that feel a certain way when I read it?" And Mara had always said the same thing, because whoever wrote it meant it. They really meant it, and you can tell. She thought about playing the ballade tonight, about meaning every note of it. She started the car. She drove out of the parking lot and onto the street, the hotel receding behind her in the rearview mirror, its lit windows shrinking as she drove. The city was quiet at this hour, not empty but quieter, the streets belonging more to the people who moved through them at midnight than to those who owned them during the day. She drove carefully, her hands on the wheel and her mind in the middle distance between what had happened tonight and what it might mean for tomorrow and the day after. She did not let herself plan too much. Planning things that had not yet declared their intentions was a way of setting yourself up for a specific kind of grief. She had learned this. She kept the planning small and the present large, and she drove home in the dark with the card in her pocket, and the music still alive in her hands in the particular way that music stays alive in a pianist's hands after a performance, not as sound but as sensation, as the ghost of movement, as the memory of keys under fingers doing exactly what they were meant to do. She parked outside the apartment. She let herself in quietly. The apartment was dim and warm and smelled of the dinner Grace had eaten with the neighbor who watched her on gala nights. Clover was visible on the edge of the bed through the half-open door, and Grace was a small shape under the blankets, breathing evenly, deeply, in the uncomplicated way of children who are not yet aware that the world requires things of you. Myra stood in the doorway for a moment, not going in, just looking. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea because the hour made it appropriate, and because she needed something to do with her hands that was not playing piano, and she stood at the counter and held the warm mug and thought about nothing in particular with a quiet she had not felt in a very long time. She took the card from her pocket. She set it on the counter. She looked at it. Arthur Lynn, a number and email address, nothing else. She drank her tea. She would call in the morning, or she would not call. The world would arrange itself into whatever it was going to arrange itself into. There had always been, underneath the practical architecture of her life, the 2 jobs and the careful money and the dental office and the tray, something that had refused to go entirely quiet, something that had practiced in the late hours when the apartment was dark and kept a 12-year-old piece of music alive in her hands through absence and inconvenience and the slow, patient erosion of years. She had not planned tonight. She had not engineered it or strategized toward it or waited for the right moment. She had simply, at a particular moment in a ballroom full of people who could not see her, stopped accepting the assumptions of the room. She had stepped over the rope. That part she had done herself. The music had done the rest. She finished her tea. She rinsed the mug. She set it in the drying rack and turned off the kitchen light and stood in the small dark apartment that was hers, that she had built out of careful work in difficult years, and she felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite peace, but lived somewhere between them. The specific satisfaction of a person who has, in one clear, unrehearsed moment, told the truth about themselves in front of people who had decided not to look. They had looked. She went to bed. She fell asleep quickly, the way she always did after the gala, the body's claim on the mind finally winning out after hours of noise and motion. And in the morning, there would be grace and breakfast, and the left rear tire, and the dental office, and the slow, ordinary machinery of the life she had built and was still building. And on the kitchen counter, in the early light that would come through the window before anyone else was awake, there would be a small white card. Real present waiting. Not a promise, not a guarantee, just a door that had not been there yesterday, standing open in the quiet of a morning that had not yet decided what it would become. She slept, and the card sat on the counter in the dark, holding its possibilities carefully, the way all small things do when they carry more than their size suggests. The night had taken something from the room, not forcibly, not unkindly, but completely. It had taken the assumption. It had taken the easy, comfortable, unchallenged belief that the people who carry the trays are best understood by the trays they carry. One woman at a piano for 7 minutes had made that belief untenable in a room that had held it for the entire evening without question. Some of the guests would forget by morning, some would not. Some things once heard cannot be unheard. The Steinway stood in the empty ballroom as the staff finished the breakdown, and the lights were dimmed one bank at a time. The velvet rope had been rehung. The bench was in its original position. The room was returning to itself, the evidence of the evening being collected and removed with professional thoroughness. But the air in that corner of the room was different from how it had been at 7 o'clock. The air in rooms always holds what has happened inside them, briefly, before releasing it, before the warmth of those 7 minutes faded entirely into the cool and ordinary atmosphere of a room being put away for the night. The Steinway sat in its corner in the darkening ballroom, and the silence around it was not empty. It was full of something that had been played completely and truly, by hands that had never forgotten how.